Great. Thank you everyone for joining us today. This is an event run by the MedTech Foundation. My name is Davod. I'm the MEDx lead, and I'm hosting this with Neil, our MEDx officer for the year. Thank you all for joining. We're joined here today by Eric Topol, by Marina Sirota, Rima Arnut, and Martia Garsemi as well. And we're going to be discussing AI within medicine, and how it's seeking to shape the future of medicine. And as we have a lot of med students here, I'm sure you're all interested to know how our careers might change by the time that we graduate. Great. So I will begin by asking the clinicians, because I know some of you are physician scientists. How did you get into AI and what inspired you to get into this field?
Sure. Should we just start?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you guys for having us. I'm a physician. I'm a clinical cardiologist and an imaging subspecialist by training. I started with a computational background in undergrad at MIT, so computation was always somewhere in my thinking. But for many years, I was a basic science researcher. And I was very interested in connecting genotypes with phenotypes, so much so that I did basic science bench work using the zebrafish model system to do just that. And I realized two things. One is that the genotype is only as good as the phenotype we could match it to, only as good as the quality and precision and scale of the phenotyping we could do. And number two is I realized that imaging was such a data-rich but very difficult source of phenotypic information. So I became very interested in how we can do better at phenotyping, not just for research in precision medicine, but also clinically. And to date myself a little bit, I think the first genomes were being sequenced as I was graduating college. And through this development, my clinical years, my research years, I was watching the genotyping half of that equation become more and more scalable, cheaper, more reliable, to the point where we could really start reducing sequencing to a science, if you will. Not that there aren't still open questions there. On the phenotyping side, I found, especially in imaging, phenotyping was still an artisan craft and still is today. So my interest in machine learning and computational imaging in general came from wanting to turn phenotyping and image-based phenotyping in particular into less of an artisan craft and into something that could be as accurate, reliable, and scalable, to match the genotyping side of that equation.
Thank you. I think it's quite interesting there that it started with kind of a basic sciences approach, and that there is a lot of overlap there in using AI tools for both basic sciences and clinical practice as well. Eric, as well, I was wondering how you got into AI and what sparked your interest there.
Well, for me, it was kind of a natural progression of being a data collector and analyzer, whether it's a genome or sensors or any other components. How are we going to deal with all this data? So it became a necessity to have a way to, and we're still working on that, multimodal AI. It hasn't actually been done, maybe bimodal AI, I guess. But yeah, so it was just, as Rena mentioned, back when we started having genome sequences, whole sequences, and that now can be looked at as a tiny data set. But and I think right now, one of the big challenges is sensors. I mean, how do you take continuous data and integrate that with all these other layers of data about a person? But that's just been how it was a necessity to get grounded in this area. Knowing this is inevitable, how we're going to need it in order to understand each individual's uniqueness.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I find it quite interesting that both of you were trying to get an understanding of data and that AI is a tool for that. Thank you. I also want to ask as well, for Marina and Marcia, for those of you who I believe trained as computer scientists, if I'm not wrong, correct me if I am wrong, what inspired you to get into medicine and applying your skills to the healthcare field?
So I did an undergraduate in computer science and then worked at Intel for a little bit. And while I was at Intel, I was assigned to a project where we were trying to model what would happen if you had, various devices with Intel circuits in them that were part of digital health solutions. And it was very device focused at the time. But I thought this was so cool that we were doing all of this, modeling and understanding of how the data from devices might predict future outcomes, that I decided to completely change, from core computer science to doing computer science in health. And so I went to Oxford, got a master's, and then came to a PhD at MIT. And in both cases, I was really motivated by this idea that, devices will give you some amount of data, and that's super cool. And again, that was, I think, the primary focus previously. But the data itself is telling you something that maybe no device that you could engineer or envision could directly measure, right? There's something more in the combination of things that we've observed from the data.
So I'll share my story as well. It's a little bit different. My interest in bioinformatics actually started in high school. I was always into the math and thought I was going to go the computer science route. And then I took a biotech class at my school where we got to do pretty cool experiments like making bacteria, transfecting genes and making bacteria glow in the dark. And I loved it. I thought the genetics and genomics aspect of it was amazingly exciting, but I wasn't very good in the lab. I was a little clumsy. So I asked my teacher, how can I use my math skills to basically do genetics? And he said, there's this field of bioinformatics. When you get to college, you'll find out. So I came in as an undergraduate at Stanford wanting to learn about what bioinformatics is. And I took my first programming class as well as my early biology classes side by side. So I did an independently designed major in bioinformatics. I was one initial class of 6 who've done that. And then kind of moved my career all along. Research-wise, I started out in the area of comparative genomics, right around the time, I guess I'll be dating myself too, when the human genome was sequenced and we had sequences of all these other species, and we wanted to know which regions of the genome are functional. So we wanted to compare them efficiently across the board. So my work started out pretty algorithmic and basic science. And then as I was starting graduate school, I heard a job talk by Dr. Topol, and I was amazed that you can use data, you can use public data to understand disease and actually make a difference in terms of diagnostics or therapeutics for patients. And that's what I decided I wanted to do. And I ended up joining his lab in graduate school and kind of going along that path. So that's sort of how I got to where I am today.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I think that was a really good introduction to all of our participants about how much you guys have done and what you're working on. I just wanted to sort of get into the more technical bits about AI, mainly around accountability. So as a medical student and as a future doctor, we're sort of trained a lot that we have to make sure we don't make mistakes. If we make mistakes, we own up to them. And there's a lot of issues around accountability and patient care. And I was wondering what your take was on where does accountability lie in an AI application in healthcare? Does it lie with the tech company? Does it lie with the clinician who's using it? And sort of how do you address that?
Well, if anyone else wants to start, please do. I will say, I mean, it's funny because in one way it's uncharted territory. In another way, it's very well trodden territory, because AI can be looked at as a device. And doctors have been using devices to help us make decisions for decades. We use a machine to spin down the blood and get a complete blood count, or lab chemistries, X-rays, anything you want. And for each of those devices, they have to be proven to work in the scenario for which they are being used medically. That's part of FDA approval. They undergo post-market surveillance for any unintended consequences. And at regular intervals, whether that be daily, weekly, or what have you, the devices need to be checked against referenced benchmarks. So the defibrillator, shock people back to life, has to be, tested every day and made sure it's charged. Imaging scanners, we take phantoms with known attributes and we image them under our scanner to make sure the scanner is imaging appropriately. So, I think that there are two levels. If physicians or healthcare workers are not appropriately using the equipment, if we are not appropriately performing our phantom tests, our benchmarking tests, or if we are fundamentally misinterpreting the information based on our own failings, I think that can be a fault of medical decision making. But if somebody sells you a lemon, a faulty scanner, or a CBC machine that doesn't do its job, et cetera, then that becomes the fault of the device. And that's something device manufacturers, they take on those liabilities today with non-AI devices. So I imagine there might be something like that. But I'm curious to hear what the other panelists say.
I think that's actually a fantastic summary of the way that you could see AI being well deployed in medical settings. I think the issue right now is that we're not there, right? And so the reason that we're not there, I would argue, hot take, so somebody might disagree with me, is on purpose, right? And so Uber had a stated policy that they were going to deploy ahead of regulation. If we get the tech out there fast enough, regulators won't know what to do. They will take a long time. And then the reality on the ground will have changed substantially, such that the regulatory discussion will be very different by the time they're ready to regulate us. And I think we're seeing the same thing now with AI in a health setting, where yes, the FDA does clear AI as a medical device, but that's not the only way that AI gets into a clinical context. It could get into a clinical context because, real example, OpenAI makes a deal with an EHR provider like Epic. And so now there's many healthcare systems in the United States that are trialing these draftings, right, of patient messages that ideally physicians should be, editing and checking before they send them on. But nobody is regulating that, right? It's not a medical device. It's just drafting this thing for you. There's also other ways that AI makes it into clinical environments. For example, if you're not trying to sell AI, broadly, but you have maybe a research team within your hospital that's developing some sort of AI and you're going to use it internally, that has to pass your IRB and maybe a quality improvement banner of a check, but it doesn't have to go through the FDA for regulation. So I do think we're in a very strange space right now where a lot of people on the technology side, at least in academia, the usual suspects who are on this panel, we're like, there are rules that we know work in other spaces. Let's get some of those rules in play, but they're not in play quite yet. And so I do think we're in sort of a weird place in the trajectory of deployment.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think, yeah, I think I think that's really interesting. I just wonder as a sort of follow-up. So I think we had the idea that sort of as AI can be considered as a medical device, you can sort of regulate it like that. But how do you account for the sort of differences with AI compared to a medical device? So with a medical device, you can model everything. You can sort of check the physics on how everything's going to work. And maybe with AI, you're going to get outcomes which you weren't necessarily expecting. So how would you account for that?
So I will say briefly, at least for some devices, whereas you could do some checking of device physics, it's not done like completely deterministically under all the settings that it might be deployed in, right? This is why we famously have SpO2 monitors on darker skin that don't work when you have low oxygenation level, which led to a lot more avoidable deaths and under treatment during COVID for darker skinned patients. So it's not a perfect system on the medical device side.
Thank you. That actually,
Yeah.
oh no, go ahead, sorry.
No, it's interesting, Marcia, because kind of what you're saying is that in some ways, AI has been released released into the medical field, I will say, maybe not released for clinical use, but without traditional approval.
Mm-hmm.
And I have my concerns about that. I think not least because, some, like a lot of models, their failure modes are not are often not predictable. So
Yes.
every device has failure modes, that's fine. Humans have failure modes. I think that the discomfort that we have sometimes with AI for medicine is that it's not that it fails, but that the failure modes are unpredictable. And this is all in a setting where not only are the failure modes unpredictable, but some of these large models, that have made big splashes this year, are quite non-transparent in the data they were trained on, the way they were trained, any sort of post-processing or guardrail rules that are in place. And I mean, that goes for, I don't want to, I mean, I could mention specific papers. I think you know what they are. It's not to point the finger at any one large model. But I mean, we're seeing it across the board. We're seeing it in papers that literally say in the methods section, we do not share any of these things. And then we see some of the outcomes of that when we try to query some of these large models, whether it be through our usage on social media, or playing around with insert your favorite chatbot here, and we get very strange answers. One of the areas that I study, I will say, is detection of congenital heart disease from fetal ultrasound. And whenever I try to ask a question about the fetus, I get some sort of not safe for work disclaimer, and it's like, this is a medical issue. I'm talking about congenital heart disease detection. I don't know. I don't know what rule is in here that is making this seem like an inappropriate topic.
Yeah. Yes, I don't want to monopolize the discussion, but I think this is an area where we have to recognize as a group of technologists that maybe regulators are underpowered or under-resourced to understand how best to come at this from all different angles, because there's both some things that are very, scary about seeing, biases that are, or bad performance that, happens in unexpected ways. And then things like you're saying, where it's like, who put this guardrail in? Like, this is unnecessary.
Yeah, just to add to the lack of transparency, which Rima has brought out, which is really important. There's also the problem of degradation of performance of models over time. And this is starting to become more illuminated that it's happening. It's, none of these are immune to it. It's been seen with ChatGPT, GPT-4, and others. The other problem, of course, in medicine is there's not much talked about for post-implementation, whereby there's continuous surveillance that's needed, which goes along with this performance degradation concern, but other things like adversarial attacks or just whatever kind of all the glitches you can imagine. So whereas there hasn't been much implementation, actually, when that starts to become a bigger deal, the problem is that health systems are not really prepared to keep a close eye and scrutiny once something is put in to putatively help, but it could certainly do harm at scale, or at least be off the track at scale. So these are issues that haven't really been confronted yet.
So the other thing I wanted to bring up is kind of the flip side of applications of AI in biomedicine, but much earlier in the kind of pipeline development and more on the research and discovery side, where it's used really widely. And many ways, so I'm not a clinician by training, and ways that we use AI and statistical models in my lab is to generate new hypotheses, which is much earlier on. So just to give students a broad view of where AI can plug in from very early discovery and trying to generate either diagnostic or therapeutic hypotheses, which can then lead to further experiments or clinical trials, to some of the models that have been alluded to, which can actually be implemented in the clinic in terms of prediction of a certain adverse outcome of interest or something like that. So there's a broad range of applications that should be considered throughout.
Great, thank you. I wanted to follow up based on that discussion about can we really understand AI, and are we revealing all our methodology when it is used in the in research applications as well as clinical applications. So I'm interested to think not just on the patient side, but also on the scientist side. How do you encourage adoption of these AI models that may not be fully understood, and how do you encourage patients to trust them, I guess? And similarly, how do you encourage scientists to trust them without necessarily having bioinformatics training as well, and patients without having statistics or computer science training? How do you encourage them to trust it to take a part in their treatment, as well as their diagnosis, as well as their research? Very broad question there.
So I can maybe start on the research side and then let others talk about more the patient side of things. So on the research side, as I mentioned, we really think about this as a way to generate hypotheses. Now, the question is whether you use traditional statistics or AI, and when is appropriate to use which. And I think that very much depends on the type of data and also the type of question that you're asking. Sometimes we can glean biological insights from simple statistical analyses like correlations or chi-square tests or enrichment, any just simple statistics. And sometimes that's good enough to find something interesting. When we don't or are not able to, then we go to more advanced machine learning techniques, allowing the computers to learn from data. And it's in my experience, it's showing the benefits and being able to generate interesting hypotheses, which has helped me engage biomedical collaborators to help validate some of the findings and go from there. So we think a lot about the data that's available, the question that we're asking, and then demonstrating success as a way to kind of start conversations and figure out, does this make sense in terms of follow-up scientifically?
I can put in a word for evidence, compelling evidence. So one of the problems we've had with AI since the deep learning phase began, when it got more serious in healthcare, the lack of really compelling evidence is grossly apparent. So we have a review, it's about 90 randomized trials done so far. Most of them are very small. And it's hard to get trust of a medical community when you don't have compelling data. The willingness to do these trials, the funding of these trials, they don't have to be randomized even. They can be well done, large prospective trials, but they're just very few of them. So it's hard to engender trust. And in many ways, if you have compelling data, the explainability feature becomes much lesser centered. If it's really working and doing something that's extraordinary, people will be more apt to adopt it because there's many things in medicine that we don't explain that we use every day. So what we have is a real gap, commitment to doing the trials, the studies that are overriding concerns about efficacy and safety.
Eric, I have a question for you. Do you think that AI needs to demonstrate superiority, or is a measure that has to do with scalability, time, time investment and so forth, important enough that something that's simply non-inferior would be acceptable?
Yeah, well, a great question, of course. It depends a bit on the use case. So, for example, if you're just trying to implement ambient conversation to synthetic notes and all the other downstream functions, you might not have to go to any great lengths because the experience might be enough to promote adoption. On the other hand, it varies with the type of liabilities that you could face for other indications. So, I think this is it's a complex question that you ask, but it's something that has barely been grappled with. It needs to be much more considered. Unfortunately, it hasn't really been in the minds of the people that there's about 630 or 40 FDA approved AI algorithms. And to your note about transparency, most of them have never been published, most of these studies. And they claim, proprietary. And most of them are retrospective and small. And, how is the medical community ever going to adopt these algorithms when can't even review the data, no less what is known about it is that it's not much there. So hopefully that's going to change. But we've seen a sea of algorithms that are very suboptimal that be hard to drive change in medical practice. I'm convinced that many of these actually are really good algorithms, but they've never been appropriately tested, never been fully disclosed as to the findings, and it's a mess.
I just wanted to follow up on the sort of explainability aspect of it. So as a doctors often, when you're speaking to patients, you need to get informed consent about a procedure, about a treatment, about a diagnostic tool. So you're trying to explain to a patient the risks and how the procedure works, for example. So how do you do this in AI in a way that I guess patients can understand, and as well as how do you get doctors to understand the system well enough that they can explain it to others? I know we've sort of mentioned sort of having a lot of data behind it and having data to back up your claims is important, but how else should sort of doctors be informed, and how should they explain this to their patients?
I'm not actually sure how much AI is going to need to be explained to patients, unless it is, I think that I'll say, unless it is specifically an algorithm around clinical decision making, which supplants current logic or common sense of clinical decision making. Like, we assume someone with chest pain should get a ECG, but then AI algorithm comes along and says, no, they should get a dental cleaning, right? It's like, if an AI algorithm is coming to change the common sense of decision making, I think then one would have to explain, and I think one has to go through the validation data and outcomes, and some of these trials that Eric is talking about that we need more of. I don't know how many current AI-driven clinical decision-making tools actually fall into the category that I just described. It might become more and more common, or maybe there's some, Maureen and Eric, that you can remind me of if they come to mind. In terms of AI just helping us do a version 2.0 of things that are already clinically accepted within the decision-making framework, but just better, I don't know that those, I think those will be invisible to patients and to most clinicians, to be honest with you. We don't alert patients every time a new software version of whatever software we're using comes out. Stuff like that. I think it's that invisibility that puts a responsibility on clinicians, researchers, reviewers, hospital administrators, etc. That is the level where they're going to have to assess these things, understand how they work, and decide if they want to bring those into their clinics. But I don't know that that's going to get to the patient-physician interface quite as often as we might think. I wrote a review where I borrowed from the American poet and activist Gil Scott Heron, and I said the revolution will not be televised, right? And by that I meant that by the time AI is in place, a lot of it's going to be invisible.
Yeah, along the lines, again, I'm not a clinician, so I'll caveat with that. But you also might want to think about a framework where it's not clinician versus AI, right? It's a situation where you figure out, and the same thing with a research scientist, it's figuring out how we work together to generate new questions on the science side or to help patients better. And does it make sense? Does AI improve certain outcomes of interest? Basically, that needs to be evaluated and kind of will allow things to move forward or not.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Marina, and it goes back to Rima's point as well, is that too much of the work has been the AI versus the clinician. The biggest trial ever so far is the Swedish mammography trial, where it was the radiologist versus the radiologist with supportive AI, 80,000 women's mammograms reviewed. And that's a whole lot better construct, or 3 arms. But it all kind of goes back to Gary Kasparov and, chess, the man versus machine thing. And unfortunately, most of the clinical research still is in that mode. And I think that's, just not where it's at. So yeah, I hope we'll see much more of the hybrid approach, because that's the natural one. AI alone doesn't stand to have much of a chance. For most things, I would think.
And I think for discovery, that's true as well, right? It's not just, how can we work together? How can we use data? How can we use computation to ask new questions? And it's not a battle. It's trying to figure out how to cooperate and work together. And sometimes it makes sense. Again, I can only speak on the kind of discovery data side. Sometimes it makes sense to use AI, but sometimes we don't really need it. Sometimes we can get to the answer with standard statistics or, simpler approaches. So it really depends.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I've just noticed that there's a question in the chat. So any participants who want to ask a question, please put them in the chat and we'll sort of ask them on your behalf. So this question is about the cross-border collaboration of AI use and findings, specifically about how different countries might have different policies, different regulations. So how do we ensure that both sort of on the research aspect, how can researchers from different countries who might have different access to data work together? And then also, how can you roll out the product to different jurisdictions?
Oh, don't everyone volunteer at once. I feel like I've talked a lot. Eric, do you want to take it?
I'm going to pass on that one.
Okay, well, it's a good question, Amelia. I guess one answer is I don't know. For AI and non-AI devices alike, different countries have different regulatory bodies. So in some way that's not new. Maybe we look more towards international device companies or international pharma companies and how they go through the process of getting their devices and therapies approved across multiple regulatory bodies. I think that might be in terms of bringing AI to clinical practice. But you're talking more also about collaboration. Collaboration obviously starts much earlier at the research level. And, it's really tough. Maybe part of the answer is, as you say, we need to develop universal AI properties. I think there's a big problem with AI is built on data, and there are very strict policies about whether data can cross really any borders, but certainly international borders. Some people are trying to solve this with what's called federated learning. So you don't ship the data around, you ship the model around, and everybody trains it on the data while the data stays in place in their institution. I think that's really interesting. It is worth noting, I feel like if anyone says this about federated learning, they immediately get canceled. But here I am on tape. It is worth considering that trained models, neural networks, especially if they're overfit, end up basically memorizing the data they were trained on. And there have been publications in the large language model field that show that from the trained model alone, people can pull out actual data from the weights of the model. They can use the trained model to reconstruct input data. And in that paper, some of the input data was, full 16-digit credit card numbers and other sensitive information that we would not want traveling around. So federated learning is potentially a solution, but also not without its caveats.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's really interesting. And I think I mean, one thing I'm quite interested in sort of AI across borders, which I don't know if any of you want to answer or not, so feel free to pass. But it's the sort of idea that, it's like a lot of people sort of talk about AI as a way to sort of reduce disparities in medicine and in healthcare by sort of giving equal access to a doctor or like a highly trained model that can sort of treat people. And I was wondering that, obviously AI models cost a lot of money to train and to develop. So often it'll be the UK, the US, and those kind of countries that are developing them. So how do you like ensure that that's sort of rolled out to other countries? And I wondered if any of you had any opinions on that or knew of any case studies of where AI is sort of being rolled out to other areas.
Well, I can provide some insight, not into rolling out AI, but again, based on the discovery side and whether we're capturing, whether the models that we build or association studies that we do based on, let's say, molecular and or clinical data can be applicable to others around the world. And there's kind of two types of efforts that we have going on in my lab. One is leveraging publicly available molecular data sets. And I will say the majority of those have been generated on the European population. It's a huge drawback. It is not and in many cases, I will say drawbacks of public data is that we don't even know the demographic. They might not be, those information might not be even available. So we identify associations, we come up with drug targets based on these molecular data sets. And again, there are pros and cons. The pros are the data are public, they're free, we can mine it, we can make sense of it. The cons might be we don't have all the demographic information. We don't know how representative these data sets are about the general population in the state of California, in the US or worldwide. So there are efforts to generate more diverse data sets for these types of analyses, but we're not even close. So there's so much to do in that area in terms of applicability on the discovery side. And with electronic medical records, same. We run discovery studies or run predictive models on clinical data. We're lucky at UCSF, we have access to both data from UCSF, but also across the whole UC system. And that's great. We've run studies in collaboration with others where we come up with discoveries on our data, then validate them at Mount Sinai or at Stanford, at Vanderbilt, at other institutions, and the other way around. But how representative are these clinical data sets that we have to all of the US or the whole world? Still, I don't know. It's unclear. So there's a lot more to do in that space. It doesn't quite answer your question, but it gives a different perspective. I'll let Rima and Eric comment on the other on the actual crux of the question itself in terms of deployment.
Yeah, I'll add, I mean, Marina, you hit on something extremely important, right? Do we have methods and tools to describe diversity in our data? If machine learning is what it eats, how nutritious is that food, right? So that's something we're actively studying in my lab. I put my email in the chat if anyone's interested in these things as further research areas, reach out. The other piece of that, so one question is, are we thinking about the diversity of data? The other question is, are we thinking about how to implement the problem in a democratic way, for lack of a better term? And I think those two things, data diversity and problem implementation, are really going to be two major factors determining whether AI ends up being a democratizer or just another tool that the ivory tower has that the masses don't. And it is a huge issue. Yeah. I go back to this fetal detection of congenital heart disease as a case study of that, because we have this problem, right, from screening ultrasound, which everyone in the world is supposed to get, whether they're at a fancy hospital or a mom and pop clinic, and trying to get a clinical decision from that. The diversity of skills and imaging scanners that produce that data in the entire world is huge, and image quality matters. So when we first train this model, if we train only on beautiful, perfect image quality from the latest machines and the latest scanners, and that's very different than training on imaging from the types of scanners and machines that are available in the mom and pop shop. And then we will have built a model that succeeds when you're in the Ivy Trower Tertiary Medical Center and fails when you're in the real world. So we had a lot of implementation choices at our disposal. What imaging modalities do we use? What scanners? What machines? And we chose, sometimes the engineers of the world, early on said, well, why don't you use this fancy data? You have it. It's like, yeah, we have it. The rest of the world does not have it. And those are choices, that are driven from the physicians and engineers who develop these models, and whether those principles are first and foremost in their mind. AI has the potential to democratize, absolutely is not a given, unless we actively ensure that. The other piece where I worry is, again, with larger and larger models, more and more data hungry models, those deliver insights that are really interesting to study. But if they become the only game in town, then the only people who can do research become the people who have the compute and have the storage resources to iterate on data of that size. And so I think it's important to continue striving for efficiency in how we train deep learning. Efficiency allows smaller models, smaller data sets. Efficiency really should be what we strive for, because human learners aren't quite so data hungry. And efficiency allows more researchers in more places to continue driving this research forward, as opposed to having the research consolidated in the hands of the few.
All great points, Rima. I agree with all.
So we've got about 15 minutes left. So I just want to remind participants that if they want to ask any questions, feel free to raise your hand or just chuck them into the chat. But for our panelists, just to change the, just to change it up a bit. So like as a medical student, for example, I can specialize in cardiology, I can specialize in nephrology, neurology, a bunch of different things. Do you see a future where medical students and doctors can specialize in digital health as a specialty? Or do you think that it's more likely that sort of digital health will be an aspect of all these different specialties?
There are already fellowship programs in clinical informatics and related fields. So I do think that's possible.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Again, I'm not clinically trained, but I've seen a number of clinician fellows trained in my lab come with very little computational background and end up doing, I think of it I think of computation and getting computational training in kind of different levels. One level is being able to talk about, analysis, computation, machine learning, and understand what these methods do. Another level is being able to apply and run some of these models yourself, understanding the assumptions that the models make. And then the third one is methods development. And it depends on, for a trainee, either from the biomedical sciences or from the clinical sciences, where you want to fall within that spectrum. Well, first, if you're interested at all, and then if you are, then where do you fall within that spectrum of training? Obviously, for methods development, you need robust computer science training, which takes a lot of time. To be able to collaborate and understand what's easy and what's hard computationally, I think at that first level, it's manageable with a few courses and just general reading papers and general understanding. And then there's that middle ground where I think a lot of folks who are clinically or basic science trained can get by doing research, getting involved in a computational group and so forth. So I think you just need to figure out where you want to be.
Thank you. I wanted to ask as well, so with a lot of us being medical students and being in the UK, I was wondering what you thought on that theme of data accessibility, what is available within the NHS. And I know Eric has a lot of involvement in that with his review of the future of the NHS. And I was wondering what's unique about the UK system in that sense. And I know the UC system also has a lot of data availability, and I know a tool works on a lot of that. And I was wondering what you thought about the UK system and the UC system and the US as a whole, and what might be unique about each country's healthcare.
Well, that's a big one to unpack. The contrast is striking because here in the US, there's no universal health, and it's tremendously fragmented and has perverse incentives. So the difference when I was involved with the UK review is there's a unity of purpose, and the interest of the UK to be a leader in AI as expressed countrywide, even with the limited resources, is really very different. There's also the ability to execute research at scale. So, for example, I've been involved in the All of Us program, which is the most ambitious, expensive program in American medical research history. It started in 2016, and it's already expended billions of dollars. And we have 500,000 people enrolled, whereas our Future Health in the UK has enrolled 1 million people within months and aspires to quickly enroll 5 million people. So the ability to do research unfettered, low cost, at scale, answer questions quickly. This week, the 8 years of the UK Biobank is harvesting its findings, and it's had enormous impact, the leader in genomics in the world in the UK. And that's the same template that the government would like to do, no less the academics and industry within the UK. There isn't any cohesive plan for that here. Although I think if you ask people, they say, oh yeah, we'd like to be a world leader in AI, but there's no real strategy. You can't write an executive order to be the leader in AI, you know. It has to be shown by action. And so far, our action bespeaks dysfunction, like the health system. And, you know, even the UC, where you'll hear more from in a moment, there's supposed to be this UC-wide data farm, if you will, or whatever you're going to call it, warehouse. But I haven't seen any real output from the UC warehouse. I mean, it's great. I think it's terrific because the UC has got an enormous capture of patients, but the constraints of getting stuff done is an issue. Maybe Marina could address that about the UC-wide data availability.
So I can talk about that a little bit, and I don't have the international perspective, but I can talk about what we've done nationally. So at UCSF, I came to UCSF in 2015. Within a few months of joining, we had a de-identified data repository of all UCSF clinical data, ready for research purposes with no IRB needed, just mine it away, which was amazing to me at the time. I didn't have prior experience with something like that. UC-wide, it has taken time, but as of last year, we do have the same. And it's available to all researchers within the UC system. We cannot share it outside the UC system. So there's a possibility for federated learning approaches. There's also collaborations that we've set up that I alluded to before, where we build models at UCSF. We can validate them UC-wide, but we can also share the models or identify associations in other institutions. And we have been able to do that successfully in the context of predicting adverse pregnancy outcomes like preterm birth or predicting Alzheimer's disease onset. So that's the good. But nothing is simple. In theory, all of these data are in OMOP, which they are. It's a similar format across institutions, but there are differences. Even within the UCSF data that we have available at UCSF versus the UCSF data that's part of the UC-wide effort, it's different years, it's different levels of curation, slightly different ways of extracting data, so things don't quite match up 100%. It's challenging. We've seen some models work very seamlessly across institutions and others stumble. So there are efforts to aggregate this type of information. I've seen that during the pandemic, actually, one organization, Cerner, made all their COVID-19 patient data available to researchers, which we were able to take advantage of to look at some therapeutic candidates and therapeutic predictions. And it was eye-opening. It was data across 80 institutions. It was available to us to ask questions. It was fantastic, but there are limitations. We could only access the data during certain hours. We had to run analysis on their systems. So there's limitations to all this. I think these are important questions to ask. There's lots of good work going on in the space, but I think we have a long way to go as well. And I'm not even touching on anything international. So I don't know if Rima has additional insights into that or anything else relating to UC or UCSF, UC-wide.
No, I think you covered it really well, Marina. Data is hard. Data engineering is hard. It doesn't scale well. It's mired in policy red tape, even in the best of circumstances. And we're all working on that. So it's really great to see other UCs having joined the UC data warehouse. That's fantastic. Seems like there's another question in the chat.
Yeah, so just before we finish, we've got a question from Jennifer. So two questions. The first is about how often machine learning models are sort of seen as a black box and that you don't exactly know how they work. So how do we sort of take that into account when thinking about interpretability in the context of medical use? And secondly, how data quantity can limit model training. So I just wanted if anyone wants to contribute to that in the last 3 minutes we have.
Well, these are both great questions. I will say I don't think we can cover this in 3 minutes. But yeah, in terms of which machine learning method one uses, I think you should think very, very closely at what the goal is. If you're just interested in predicting for a certain patient, how likely are they to have a certain outcome, then maybe a black box is okay. But will it give you medical, clinical insight? Same thing for biological, right? This answer applies to both clinical applications as well as biomedical, more basic science research. If you're interested in understanding the mechanism or maybe want to understand why, then a black box approach is not as appropriate. Maybe you want to use some of the standard machine learning approaches like a random forest or something like that, or some combination of the two. There's very clever ways to try to interpret outputs of neural networks and other methods. And yeah, we're definitely limited by data quality. And also using data across institutions, across different studies to capture heterogeneity is another huge limitation. But I'll stop there and let others comment as well.
Excellent points, Marina. I would add, I've gone back and forth on the need for interpretability. Partly I say, there's a lot of tests in medicine that I just order and I don't exactly know how they work, right? So, but I think if I did have a question about it, someone could explain. Somebody knows. I might not know on a daily basis about all the tests, but it is known. I think the need for interpretability is somewhat a function of how unpredictable the failure modes of the model are. If we validate a model, and of course it fails, but we see that the failures are very predictable. It's always this type of patient or this type of whatever. I think we can kind of work our way around that. Validation will have provided some surrogate for confidence in the model, when to use it, when to trust it, when not to trust it. The more wild card and the more unpredictable the failures are, I think the more concern there is for, hey, what is this doing? A human would never make that mistake. And the more need for interpretability. These are things I think about actively. I don't know the right answer or the right combination of those things. And the other thing I think of a lot is how much do we want to teach computers to think the way humans think? And how much is it acceptable that computers might think of something completely orthogonally to how a human brain works? Maybe better, maybe faster, I don't know. And I think that also comes down to how predictable are the failure modes.
I can't add to the comments by both Marina and Rima. They're excellent.
Great, thank you. That brings us to the hour. I just want to thank all of our guests for joining us today. We've been really engaged by all of your insights and all of your experience. And we can only hope to be as involved in such a quickly advancing field as you all are in the future. And we really look forward to following all your work. And we appreciate that you've taken time today to speak to us and inspire us to follow in your footsteps, I guess. And I want to thank all the audience who joined us today. And I want to say, feel free to reach out to our speakers. Some of them have put their contacts in the chat. And if you're interested in following up on these kinds of topics, we were recommended the New England Journal of Medicine AI medicine podcast, as well as Eric's Grand Truths podcast as well, in which he discusses machine learning as well as other topics within medicine. But thank you. We will post the recording onto YouTube, and it will be available for anyone to rewatch as well as share with anyone else. But once again, thank you, Eric. Thank you, Marina. Thank you, Rima. And I know Martia had to leave early, but thank you to Martia as well.
Thank you so much for having us. Good luck.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah. So
thanks
so
very
much.
much. This was so fun.
Thank you.
Bye.
See you.